let me go back to some of the examples I gave at the beginning and then think those through again. So, I have these quotes again. The first one, that technology helps us, all of us connect. Okay, and to a certain degree, that's definitely true. We have a desire to connect, we have the capacity to connect, and technology is certainly amplifying that. But more and more, we're also finding that it also amplifies undesirable aspects of our personality. So recently, there was a study that came out that suggests that people are actually less happy when they spend time on Facebook because the impression that you get is everybody's having a great time, right? And that you're alone in your sorrows. Because what is everybody doing? They're trying to show themselves off in the best light on Facebook. And as a consequence, you get an inaccurate picture of everybody else. You become unhappy, okay? There's a very well-known phenomenon called cyber balkanization, which is that now that we have more and more choice in what news we consume, we end up consuming only the news that already agrees with our political views, right? And this is very well established in the literature. And I believe correctly, people are wondering whether this is the right thing, because in an earlier generation, we were much more likely to be exposed to viewpoints that were different from our own. And there again, there are studies that suggest that when you're exposed to ideas different from your own, you're at least less willing to be aggressive about your own views. And then finally, there's outright cases of negative use of technology, such as with cyberbullying, right? I mean, there have been some famous instances of young teenagers committing suicide because they were bullied online. All right, so what about the Arab Spring? Okay, there was a lot of Facebooking and tweeting happening during these things. What's going on? Well, I think one of the more interesting things was that in Libya, the press was amazingly silent about social media. And that's because it became a protracted civil war, right, where if any technology mattered, it was weapons, not information. And Gaddafi at one point basically cut off his country's internet. Right? So it was gone, but the protesters were still able to organize. How did they do this without the internet? We have no idea. Syria is going under a similar situation, right? Again, the protests are still happening. The Syrian government also shut down the internet. It's fine. We've seen this before. The American Revolution happened well without the internet, right? Where there's a will, there's a way. Back then people used lanterns, right? One if by sea, one if by land, two if by sea, right? So the communication tools are always there. They might not be the fastest, and they certainly will help the people who have them. But the more important thing is whether you have the will to, in this case, cause revolution. And then finally, another interesting counterexample is China. Okay, so this is a country that now has close to 500 million internet users. Okay, certainly more than the entire population of the United States. Last count, 900 million mobile phone users. Okay, so if these tools were the cause of people overthrowing a dictatorial government, we should long ago have seen that happening in China. Okay, but the reality is most Chinese citizens are actually quite happy, right? Their country is growing economically. Yes, there is a little bit of political repression, but the vast majority of the country doesn't experience that on any personal basis, on a daily basis. So they're quite happy. Nobody really wants to rock the boat. They're not about to go and pick up, and that's even with news of other countries coming into the country. In fact, one of the things that I find really interesting is when you talk to your Chinese friends, they're often amazingly happy with the government of China, despite the fact that there's a lot of critical reception from outside, right? And they don't understand why. I mean, there's no reason why they should be unhappy, because on a daily basis, things are much better than, for example, in Syria or Libya. Okay, let's take a look at mobile money in this case. So the history of development, unfortunately, is also full of lots of technologies that have basically become little more than dust-gathering doorstops. There was a previous generation, for example, of agriculture interventions that tried to get people in developing countries to use more tractors. And these devices were often not fit for the smallholder farming that was taking place. More and more, we are using our power as, our power in terms of economic power to use developing countries as dumping grounds for the technology. So they're not necessarily, benefiting from the technology on that side. There's some evidence that is trickling in, although I think it's growing, that suggests that there are a lot of people for whom they will spend money first on their mobile phone before a certain amount of food for their families and before education for their children, right? And it's not everywhere and it's not consistent, but it suggests that any view that says a mobile phone is necessarily a good thing should be suspect. And then finally, it's really interesting that if you hang out with the business school crowd, they talk about Coca-Cola as this fantastic thing because you can go into any small village in the world and there will be some lady there selling Coca-Cola, okay? And I see people nodding because if you're from public health, you think, why is this a good thing? Why should people with the least dental coverage be encouraged to drink sugar water, right? It makes no sense whatsoever. One problem with, for example, a two-way pipe into the wallets of the people who are the least educated is that they're also the least able to resist the kind of marketing that is put out there by large corporations that have a huge budget to do the marketing to sell stuff that people might not actually need, right? And so even though the convenience factor is high, that convenience is coming at the cost of basically opening up the floodgates to companies who know how to extract consumers to buy things that might not be optimal for their lives. All right, so in our project with the text-free user interface, Indrani Mehdi, who was the lead researcher on that project, what she really wanted to do was to create some kind of electronic system that would make it easier to match women who worked in jobs, cleaning houses, cooking, taking care of kids, and so on, to wealthier employers who would basically hire them as household help. And what she found was that she had a nice system where you could do all of this, and it didn't require literacy to use, but that ultimately she needed to embed it in some kind of system. It was not enough to just simply put these kiosks out there. So she worked with a local nonprofit organization, and initially she found that the nonprofit, even though it also wanted to have a system like that it needed to go out and talk to individual women in these communities to get interest in the project, and then also go talk to potential employers so that they would actually sign up. So we had a paper system, and over the period of about a year, we spent all of our effort on trying to get that paper system working. We never could quite get there. It was just an immense effort on all sides doing all of the coordination. We had much better luck using this particular system when we went to an organization that was already doing a paper version of it successfully, and then helped them effectively digitize a lot of their back-end bookkeeping. And strangely enough, in that situation, the user interface part of it became less relevant because the people who were interfacing with the people who were illiterate were actual human beings. And we could not easily get rid of that point. So the technology, despite the fact that it tested well in the lab, didn't ultimately fulfill a useful function in the larger context of a system that provided a useful function. Okay, so recommendations. The thesis, again, is that technology magnifies human intent and capacity. And what that means is for international development, you need to have the right intent and capacity there first before the technology will contribute. And I want to be very clear that I'm not saying technology has no contribution. It can have a positive impact, and there are many situations where it will. But that means that you need to have some positive thing happening already. And what does that mean in terms of recommendations? If for some reason you feel constrained to use ICT, sometimes there's funding that is directed for ICT. Sometimes, some people's job description requires them to be the ICT head for something. In some cases, you just have a very strong desire to use the technology. I would say that the best way to work is to look for organizations that are already having the kind of positive impact that you want to increase, and then to find a way to use the technology to amplify that impact. And it's at that point that all of the issues of designing the right technology, of doing the right kind of user studies, and all of that make it matter. There's some people for whom they really just get excited about the ICT world, whether because they used to be engineers in the past. They don't necessarily feel the need to use technology itself as intervention. And then I would say the most interesting use of technology is actually not to help people become consumers of technology, but to become producers of technology, right? So, there's a tendency to associate the technology industry with wealth and ability, but really the people benefiting in that industry are not the consumers, right? Every time you buy an iPhone, you get a little bit of fun and convenience out of it, but it's Apple shareholders and employees who are getting rich. So the question in development is, how do you get more of those people into the industry side, into the production side of technology rather than as a consumer? And I think that requires a lot, it requires very long-term thinking, but some very easy things you can do are to find people who are very excited, who already have a reasonable amount of education, possibly interested in entrepreneurship, and to either mentor them or help them do the things that they want. And then finally, if you're not constrained to using technology, then I would say that it's actually far more important to work on these things because these are the things that ultimately change the underlying thing that I think we're all interested in changing. If you think about it, imagine some ideal world where everybody has all of the technology they need, but they're just as uneducated as they currently are, or just as otherwise constrained in their life as they currently are. Is that really, is that the world that we're after? Or would it be better to have a world where everybody has the education where if they wanted the technology, they could easily get a job, buy the technology themselves, or they don't have the constraints to the life that they want to lead, but they don't necessarily start off with the technology. And at least for me, the answer is very clear.